Okay, so here we are with part 3 of definition argument. So let's take a second before we dive into the 4 types of definition and just do a real quick overview. So with definition argument, you're looking at words and ideas that shift and change over time based on values that cultures and societies apply to them. We know that our claim type strategy is criteria match. So we have this template, X is or is not a Y. Y is going to be our term of definition, and we are going to define that term via research and via our beliefs and values. And then once we define the term, we do the match part. So we've set the criteria for the Y, and now for the X, we're going to test that X to see if it matches or does not match the criteria set forth for the Y. So the information that I'm getting ready to go over for the 4 types of definitions specifically relates to the Y. So in the X is or is not a Y, and we have a claim, and I think the claim I'd used earlier was spanking is or is not child abuse. So this would be 4 types of definitions, 4 different ways that we could define child abuse, 4 methods for doing that. I'm not going to define child abuse. I'm going to use something much more lighthearted and fun. So let's go ahead and dive in. There's the 4 types: the Aristotelian, the operational, the authoritative, and then you as the writer can do your own extended definition. So let's look at each of these in turn. So with the Aristotelian, it's going to define the item through the rule of justice. So one thing about your Y term, you want to make sure that it's narrow enough that it can be defined and argued in this 3 to 5 page paper. So you're not going to have something that is so broad that it can't be defined using simply 3 criteria. You also want to make sure that your claim is something that is controversial and not something that is a fact. You want to make sure that, so you wouldn't argue something like smoking is bad for health, because that's an accepted fact. And you wouldn't even want to do something like smoking is a public health threat, because that's also accepted as fact. So you want to make sure that whatever your claim is something that is not accepted already by the majority of people. So here, for example, we're going to look at the idea of dog. So we're going to try to limit the class so that most animals are outside of that class and that only dogs are inside of it. So we might say, okay, animals that have 4 legs are dogs. And that's true. Most dogs are born with 4 legs. However, there's a whole heap of other animals that also have 4 legs. So we got to get more specific than that. So we might say, okay, animals with 4 legs that bark are dogs. And so that limits it for sure. It's going to get rid of like cows and tigers and elephants and things like that. However, there are some animals that aren't necessarily considered dogs that bark, such as like prairie dogs, and a student once argued that squirrels barked. So we might say, okay, we need another criteria to limit that category a little bit more. So something that is somewhat unique to dogs is that they live in packs. So we might say, okay, then animals that have 4 legs bark and live in packs. Even though that pack might be a domestic pack where the dog is part of a family, those are going to be dogs. And there are probably still animals that have all three of these traits that aren't dogs, and that's okay. We would deal with that in the rebuttal. So it doesn't have to be a 100% everything matches situation in order for a definition argument to be successful. So again, we're not proving, we're just trying to persuade and come to sort of a common ground. So keep that in mind as we work through this. So Aristotelian thinking helps you narrow the class of the term that you're defining so that it is definable, so that it's not too big, okay? So that's how Aristotelian will be useful to you. Operational definitions define something through data, basically. So, and not everything can be defined this way, but it is useful sometimes. So if we're looking to define, say, a specific breed of dog, then we know the American Kennel Club is kind of considered the standard for breed designations, and a lot of the dog shows use the AKC criteria to determine the standard for the breed. So this would be something that you could use an operational definition for. So this summer, our Boston Terrier passed away. But we had her for 18 years, so she's very special. And so I always use her in this example. So, and this comes from the AKC's website. So it is a secondary source. So according to the American Kennel Club's website, the ideal Boston Terrier is, and then here's a quote, under 15 pounds. The length of leg must balance with the length of body to give the Boston Terrier its striking square appearance. Because this source is a website, there is no page number down here. So this would be the correct way to cite a web source without page numbers. There was no author given for this information. The American Kennel Club was the author, so there's not an author for me to put down here in the parenthetical citation either. I chose to include an image. This is not my dog. This came from Ashley Photography. So if I wanted to use an image in my paper, that's fine. I would just want to make sure that in the text of the paper and on the Works Cited page that I cite that source, because even an image is a source and needs to be cited. So there are times when an operational definition is useful. If you're purchasing a dog that you might want to use as a show dog, you definitely want to keep these things in mind. So if you are trying to argue that a certain chemical is bad for the environment, then you would maybe want to look at levels of that chemical and when it becomes negative to health. So there are definitely times when an operational definition is going to be helpful in proving or persuading your audience. Okay, so the other thing is a reportive definition. And so this is where you use information from a source, an expert, to define the term. So I've looked this up, and Fred Comstock is, at this time, he probably is not now, but when I made the slideshow, he was the president of the Boston Terrier Club of America, and they had a little book. And in that book, he kind of gave this sort of soft personality type definition, not empirical. for the Boston Terrier. So they're active dogs that love to play, and without basic training, they may jump on you and maybe even give little nips while playing. And that was on page 76. And I have Fred Comstock, and I have told who he is. So then on the works cited page, I'll see Comstock, Fred, period, the title of the book, and the publication information. So reportive definitions are good in that, remember, we're basing this argument kind of on beliefs and values, but we want to show that other people, experts, knowledgeable people and knowledgeable organizations support our beliefs and values, or have informed, might be a better word to use. They've informed our beliefs and values. And so we're not just, out on a limb making things up. This is sort of an established idea, and here are the reasons that this remains a belief or a value, and why it might be important to pull other people into that. So here's my little pup, and her name was Willow. So another thing you can do is you can come up with a definition on your own, and this is particularly helpful when you're wanting to define sort of a term that really has cultural value, and there's no way you could look up best friend in the dictionary and actually get a definition that is going to in any way whatsoever encapsulate what a best friend is. So I might say, okay, a dog is a woman's best friend. And so the word or the idea here that I'm going to try to define is this idea of, well, okay, what is a best friend? So I'm going to have to create some criteria for best friend, and then I'm going to have to show how a dog can, because I have can fit or embody that criteria. So I'm going to define the term through comparison contrast. So what do the terms have in common, and how are they different? So my real life best friend is named Jennifer Wilson. She has been my friend since kindergarten. So I might say, okay, friends need to be people you've known for at least 5 years. They need to be people who can make you laugh, people you can trust, and could these ideas of, having a long relationship, being able to communicate easily and trust, could these things also be attributed to a pet, in this case to Willow? And for me, of course, the answers for these are yes. So in the paper then, I would give details about my relationship with my human best friend, and I would establish these 3 ideas as my criteria. Friends for more than 5 years, easy to communicate with, very trustworthy. Those are my criteria for best friend. And then I'm going to apply those criteria to my sweet little puppy. So hopefully going through this information makes it easier to understand a little bit about definition argument. The big idea is to keep in mind that the structures this criteria match. You've got the claim, X is or is not a Y. The Y is going to be your backing, where you're going to fully define the term, and you're going to use a lot of examples and illustrations. And then in the grounds is where you're going to look specifically at the X. I think it's smart to do the warrant and backing first. So to come up with the criteria for your Y term first, then go into the grounds. As always, I'm here to help. Just shoot me an email and let me know what you need.